So today we're going to be going over our AIS training in association with our watercraft inspection and decontamination stations that we're having across the state. And to start off, we just want to highlight our focus here for game fish and parks, and that would be looking at our vision and mission statements. So our mission statement here with South Dakota Game Fish and Parks is that we serve and connect people and families to the outdoors through effective management of our state's parks, fisheries, and wildlife resources. And then our vision statement would be is to conserve our state's outdoor heritage to enhance the quality of life for current and future generations. And I have that highlighted. With AIS, it's very important that we don't look at just our current state that we're in, but also looking into the future and trying to preserve our waters for our future generations and our kids to have the same opportunities that we have. So a little bookkeeping here with GFP employees. We have different codes for our AIS work that we do across the state. The primary two that you're going to be looking at is AIS 3, which would be our outreach and education, and then AIS 5, which would be watercraft inspection and decontaminations. So when you guys are out there doing signage or boat ramp painting, you would be using AIS 3. And then when you guys are doing roving WID, that would be AIS 5. And if you guys ever have any questions on that, just let me know. But we want to make sure that we're documenting this correctly as well. All right, so let's get into it. What is AIS? So in order for something to be an aquatic invasive species, it has to be non-native to South Dakota. It has to have a negative impact to the ecosystem, and that could be through food web altercations. With zebra mussels, that would be looking at like filtering out our water and moving a lot of the nutrients into the benthic area or the lake floor, or having competition with our native species. And it could also have a negative impact to human uses, which is obviously what has brought the most attention here to the state. So prevention of fishing or recreation, reduced efficiency of water intake, so your dam systems. This is a big issue on the Missouri River system, and it's very costly. And our last bullet point being a financial cost to control. So that's why we're trying to hope to get more entities on board here. Department of Ag would be one of them. But once zebra mussels are infesting a water body, it will come at a drastically large cost to the stakeholders of whatever is present in that system. So we currently are looking at different options to try to help prevent that cost continuing to increase. One of those being a study out in the Black Hills at School of Mines. We're looking at some biofilm that could help prevent zebra mussels from attaching to infrastructure in the Missouri River system. All right, here is a list of South Dakota's aquatic invasive species. In black, you'll see what is present here in the state, and then in red is what is encroaching here to South Dakota. So for our fish species, we have several different carp species: bighead carp, common carp, grass carp, and silver carp. And then we also have European rudd and western mosquitofish. And the fish labeled in red we'll discuss later on in the presentation. And then for our plant species, our two most concerning would be curly leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil, but we also have a brittle naiad, common reed, didymo out in the hills, and then flowering rush and purple loosestrife. And then for invertebrate family, our biggest concern would be zebra mussels, but then we also have Asian clam, New Zealand mud snail, red room melania, and then red swamp crayfish and rusty crayfish here in the state. So starting off with our invasive fish. If anyone's from the eastern side of the state, you should be fairly familiar with big-headed carp. These are in the invasive carp family, but we have two different carp species here currently in the state. I guess actually three. We have silver carp and bighead carp as well as grass carp. Silver carp do not grow quite as large as bighead carp do. They grow up to roughly 60 pounds, and then bighead carp get up to 90 pounds. Most of the silver carp that you'll probably see in the state, though, would be in that 3 to 15 pound range. Both of these species have multiple spawns throughout the year, which just adds to their invasiveness. Once they are present in a system, in most cases they will actually occupy up to 50% of the fish biomass in that system within the first few years. These fish can lay up to 3.7 million eggs for the silver carp and 1.9 million for bighead carp. Another reason why they can take over systems so quickly. And for a manager's concern would be their diet. They consume up to 40% of their body weight daily in phytoplankton, which is the same food source that our juvenile game fish need in their first year of life and to get them through their first winter. And with that, they also move that food availability more to the benthic area of the lake or river system. Can anyone spot the big-headed carp in this slideshow? Yes?
Bottom left one.
Correct. A few key characteristics that you'll be able to determine a bighead carp from other fish would be the lack of the black dot behind their opercle. Gizzard shad is fairly prevalent along the Missouri River system in a few of our lakes in eastern South Dakota, and that would be the biggest giveaway there. But also looking at their eye placement and the size of their eye is another few characteristics that would help you identify a big-headed carp versus some of our other native species in the state. The reason why I bring that up is that, as you can see, they look fairly familiar to a lot of other species that we have here, and that is why we have some bait restrictions here in the state. But before I get to that, I'm just going to give you a little background information on silver and bighead carp. They were actually purposely stocked in the United States initially to help improve water quality on aquaculture ponds down in the southeast. But unfortunately, with some flooding events, these fish were able to make it out of those aquaculture ponds and make their way into some of our larger river systems along the Mississippi River. And over time, they've been able to make their way up to South Dakota and even up into North Dakota. But this all happened in the last 40 years. So here's a diagram of South Dakota and their current distribution. They are in all three of our tributaries off the Missouri River system. Those three tributaries being the James River, the Big Sioux, and the Vermilion River. There are a few barriers that these fish have, though, that have prevented their future spread across the state. The first one being Gavin's Point Dam down near Yankton. The Vermilion Spillway, this is about 25 miles west of Sioux Falls here. And the falls here in Sioux Falls. And there is actually current research being conducted on any further expansion of their range with the 2019 flood. Currently, that research has shown that they have not been able to make it past these barriers. But in 2019, the emergency floodgates came open on Vermilion Lake, which raised some concerns. And with the high flows that we had, there was some risk level with those fish getting over the falls with how high the water was. So as I mentioned briefly before, these fish do eat phytoplankton, which is what our game fish eat. So there's some competition there, and that forces a change in their trophic position. It shifts that production to the benthic area, which can be advantageous for certain species, but for most of our game species, it does not help them. And another thing that, you guys might have seen this on some YouTube videos, or if you've been on any one of these river systems, you might have seen this, but silver carp can actually jump out of the water. They have very sensitive hearing, and when there's any loud noise with a boat motor, or even when you're kayaking down the river and your paddle's hitting the water, this can scare these fish and they'll jump out of the water several feet. And it's such a concern that there's actually no wake zones in several water bodies that have these, because someone can get concussed if hit in the head by one of these fish. A 30-pound fish to the face would not feel very good. And so, as I mentioned before, bighead carp look fairly similar to a lot of our native species, and that's why we have bait closures throughout the state, so we don't accidentally spread these fish to new water systems. So all the areas that you see with the diagonal lines across there is where we have bait closures in the state. And so that would be the entirety of the James River in South Dakota, because they've been able to make their way all the way up into North Dakota. And then the West Fork and East Fork of the Vermilion River. And then the Big Sioux up to roughly the Brookings area. And here's just another photo of a juvenile big-headed carp. All right, moving on to another invasive fish species that we have here in the state, common carp. This should be fairly familiar to most people. Common carp are fairly widely distributed across the United States. A few of the negative components of a common carp is that they uproot vegetation, and with that, it increases turbidity by stirring up sediments. So back in the day, for example, Lake Madison used to be a very vegetated system, but common carp were able to make their way into Lake Madison, and it caused a lot of issues with water quality and increased the turbidity tremendously in that system. And there's been several management strategies of, for example, commercial harvest of these fish. But over time, research has shown that it's very, very hard to get rid of these. And so a lot of managers just try to keep these at bay through different management strategies of barriers to that system, or continuing commercial harvest on an annual basis. These fish can also shift community composition of fish and invertebrates with that uprooting of that vegetation. All right, another carp species that we have in the state that is invasive would be grass carp, and they are also an aquatic macrophyte consumer. They can consume up to 61 pounds of macrophytes per pound of body weight annually. So we try to give this illustration just for some jaw-dropping effect. But this fish here that Nate Lecker, one of our resource biologists in the Sioux Falls office, is holding is 62.5 pounds. So technically that fish could consume almost 2 tons of aquatic macrophytes in a given year. Game Fish and Parks actually stocks a triploid species of grass carp here in the state in very localized situations, if it makes sense. These triploid grass carp cannot effectively have any spawn or any recruitment into the system, though they are sterile. So that's the only reason why we were able to stock them, because they can help decrease the amount of vegetation that a system has. Dami Quarry up just south of Aberdeen, we actually stocked them in there, and that was a very good success story for knocking back the vegetation in that system. But the only legalized stocking is of that triploid species of grass carp, and Game Fish and Parks has the only authority to do that. All right, European rudd. One of our local systems that have these would be the interstate pond just south of Brookings. These European rudd can hybridize with golden shiner, which is a native species in South Dakota. They are omnivorous, so they eat both fish and plant species. They can alter macrophyte communities similar to invasive carp species. If you were to catch one of these, they could range anywhere from a few inches all the way up to over a foot in length. So once they get to that larger size, they surpass the gape limitations of most of our predator species, which also helps with their invasiveness. And then we have western mosquitofish. They are very aggressive in nature, and they can have negative effects on our native species. They were actually initially introduced to help control mosquito populations but they found that they were not very effective, and actually some mosquito populations increased in size after these were introduced. We do not have any management strategies for these, since these are fairly widespread throughout the state. But as you can see in this picture on the right, they have a fairly unique body composition and fairly easily identifiable out in the field. All right, moving over to our invasive plants. So overall, as I go through these, most of our invasive plants have very similar characteristics overall. They grow extremely fast, and they form very dense mats. So this outcompetes our native plants, and it also inhibits a light penetration through how dense their canopy growth is. And with that, it also inhibits growth of phytoplankton, which our juvenile game fish need in their first year of life, and other species within the system. As you can see on the right, how dense these mats are. They grow so densely that it actually prevents any viable habitat for our fish as well. So they're not good for human users or our fish within the system. And they also can decrease dissolved oxygen during their decay over the winter and fall months. The other thing that it makes these so invasive, you see in this photo here that this motor has churned up a bunch of these plants. They actually can spread through fragmentation. So unless you kill them with hot water, they're very easily able to transport through your boat trailer, through your motor, into a new system, and can become established into a new water body. And that's why we stress the importance of clean, drain, dry, and not transporting any vegetation, mud, or water when you are going from one lake to another. One of our biggest culprits would be curly-leaf pondweed. There are several lakes in South Dakota that have these, but they spread by fragmentation and turions, which is a little bud that would is a growth off of this plant, and they overwinter and then become established and start growing the following spring. There has been a few instances where we have treated these if we find them early enough in their establishment, but they become established very quickly and can become very widespread. For example, Big Stone is a fairly large lake that we have up in the far northeast part of the state, and it would cost us upwards of millions to try to treat that entire system. So once they become established, it can create habitat for some of our game species in the state, but overall we would like to prevent these from spreading just because of the nuisance it caused for a lot of our swimming opportunities and boating opportunities on these given water bodies. Eurasian water milfoil. This is actually one of our plant species that we will identify in our watercraft and inspection and decontamination app. When you ask where a boater has been, if you upload a system where Eurasian water milfoil is at, that will actually pop up next to the lake when you're typing in that data. They have a native counterpart that looks very similar to the Eurasian water milfoil, and that's native water milfoil that we have in the state. The biggest difference that we would have here is that Eurasian water milfoil has 12 to 21 leaflet pairs, where our native counterpart has only up to 12 leaflet pairs on the plant. These are present in the Missouri River system on Lake Oahe, Lake Sharp, and Lewis and Clark Lake. And as I go forward, as I mentioned before, all of these have very similar characteristics of being able to spread by fragmentation or by their seeds. Brittle naiad, this is fairly localized down the far southeast part of the state, and it's very unique in its characteristics, as you can see on the right. It has almost a branching tendency off of its stems, and we don't have any other invasive species here in the state that looks anywhere similar to this, so try to have a photographic memory of that because it's fairly easily identifiable. One of our interns here mentioned that he worked up in Deerfield this last year. Didymo is an invasive species that we have out in western South Dakota. A common name for this is rock snot. And as you can see on the photo on the right, it's a fairly accurate statement for this invasive plant. These will completely inundate your substrate in a system. They are found in streams, and this plant species is the reason why we outlawed felt-soled boots across the United States, because the seeds of these can become attached to your felt on your wader boots, and then when you go over to a different stream, you can transport this plant species through that pathway. But this can also make for fishing to be very difficult. As you can see, it completely covers the stream bottom, and it's also not very aesthetically pleasing to the eye either. Moving on over to our wetland ornamentals. They get this name just by their overall attractive presence. A lot of them have very unique flowers that grow off of them, but each one of these, I guess the purple loosestrife and the phragmites both have native counterparts that look fairly similar, but they grow in dense or less dense mats, and they also don't grow as tall as their native counterparts. But once again, these outcompete their native plants. They grow in such dense mats that wildlife doesn't even want to use them for refuge from weather or from predators. It also prevents access. Phragmites can grow up to 10 feet in height, so you can't even traverse through them and know what direction you're going. These distributions have not been well documented in South Dakota thus far, but there has been federal funds that are coming through that are going to be helping with that. But most of these are found on several of our river systems in the state, and then purple loosestrife is actually out in western South Dakota as well. And then flowering rush is found more in the center part of the state on Lake Fulton and Lake Louise. All right, looking at our invertebrates. Our two most detrimental invertebrates that you have in the United States would be zebra mussels and quagga mussels. Currently, we do not have any quagga mussels in the state, but we do have zebra mussels in several locations. The biggest way to tell the difference between the two of these is first their shape. If you look on the left at the diagram of the zebra mussel, you can see the sharp hinges on that shell, as well as a flat surface on the bottom of this shell. If you were to grab one of these, you can actually stand a zebra mussel up on its edge and it will stay standing, where a quagga mussel has more rounded hinges and they will fall over if you try to stand them on edge. These are the only two invertebrates that have Byssal threads. It's hair-like follicles that they grow off of their shell that helps them attach to different surfaces. Zebra mussels prefer hard substrate, riprap, docking structures, boats, even plants to attach to, where quagga mussels can actually establish right on the mud bottom. So luckily we have not had any quagga mussels here, because they would be more applicable to a lot more of our water bodies than our zebra mussels are. The other reason zebra mussel gets its name, as you can see on the diagram, the bicoloration that they have, it resembles a zebra, and both of these are relatively the same size. Zebra mussels were first introduced in the United States in the 80s. They were first found in Lake St. Clair near Detroit, Michigan. They were able to spread through ballast water. Ballast water is brought into some of these large cargo ships to help with their stabilization when they're traversing down water bodies. And they were able to suck up veligers, which free float in the water, and brought them into the Great Lakes. And when they circulated their water, they dumped all those veligers into the Great Lakes, and they quickly spread to several other systems throughout the United States. And now I will go over some of that distribution and that timeline. So as you can see, in just a matter of 4 years, they were able to be fairly widespread throughout the entire Great Lakes chains. And then another decade, They were present in most of the major river systems in eastern United States. And then in the following 10 years, they started spreading out west. And they were knocking on South Dakota's door in 2010, but we first found them in South Dakota in 2015. And currently, they have made their way up the Missouri River chain all the way up to Lake Sharp, which is just south of Pierre, South Dakota. And here is a map of all of the different locations that we currently have them in South Dakota. So luckily we don't have them anywhere in western South Dakota, but we do have them from our border in Nebraska and Iowa all the way up to Pierre. Our last infestation happened in 2019 on the Missouri River system, where they were able to establish themselves in Lake Francis Case and Lake Sharp. And then in 2020, they took hold in the northeastern part of the state in Lake Cochrane, Lake Kampesca, Lake Pickerel, and then Dami Corey just south of Aberdeen. And then our last infestation was in Lake Mitchell, just east of the Missouri River system, about 60 miles. And luckily that was the only lake that we found infested in 2021, and we hope to continue that low of an infestation rate going forward. So as mentioned before, some of the key characteristics of these species is their byssal threads. Byssal threads allow the Dreissenid mussels to attach to hard surfaces, but quagga mussels are able to attach to soft surfaces such as mud or other plant vegetation. But neither of these are native here, and there's actually no other mussel that have these. So if you're ever in question, if you have one of these, just look for this on the bottom of their shell, and that should be able to tell you whether or not they are invasive or not. So how do they spread? Once zebra mussels spawn, they lay up to 1 million eggs, and once those eggs develop into their next stage, they are considered a veliger. This is their larval state, and they free float in the water column. One thing that makes these so dangerous is that they are microscopic to the eye. They are roughly 1/100th of an inch and roughly the diameter of a hair follicle. So not easily seen in the water, and they are sucked up in ballast tanks, live wells. They can even be established in a bait bucket if you are throwing your minnow bucket in the water while fishing. And they can survive up to 2 weeks without food. So if you are going fishing for the weekend and you forget to pull your plugs on your boat, and you decide to go out the next day, but you heard of a new hot bite and you decide to go to another system, and then you circulate that water to give some oxygen to your fish in your live well, you now just transported those veligers into a new system, and they could potentially take hold into a new water body. So this is another reason why we stress that we need to be clean, drain, dry when we're moving from one water body to the next. We really want to make sure that we're not moving any water, and that's why we suggest boaters to bring a sponge or a towel along with them so they can dry out their boat in between uses. So now we're going to look at their life cycle. I briefly mentioned their first couple of stages of life, but so they start off as an egg and they're fertilized and they grow into a veliger. They will free float in the water column for roughly a month, and then they will eventually settle down and try to find adequate substrate to attach to. As mentioned, that substrate they're looking for is any hard, rough surfaces and roughly any dark areas, so 4 feet or deeper usually in a water column. Once they settle out, they are considered settlers, and once they first attach, they're roughly the size of like 80 grit sandpaper. It's not easily seen, and that's why we always suggest when you are looking over a watercraft that you feel along the side of the watercraft below the water line, and if you feel any rough surfaces, you want to take a closer look to see if there's any settlers attached to a watercraft. They will then grow from that location into their adult stage, and the adults will range anywhere from 6 to 45 millimeters. So for anyone that's not familiar with the metric system, they can grow just under 2 inches in length. But most of the ones you'll see are going to be about the width of your pinky nail to maybe your thumbnail, so still relatively small in size, and that's why I want to make sure that we're looking very diligently when we're looking over a watercraft, especially if it's in a high-risk situation. So, ballast tanks, this would be your wakeboarding boats, your recreational boats, or any large cargo ships that might be moving down the river system. For our anglers, this would be your live wells, and then also your bait buckets. We encourage our anglers to carry ice with them if it's in the middle of the summer and they're worried about their fish getting too hot, if they have to drain their water. But that's a good way to preserve your fish, and it actually works out a lot better if you just bring some ice and throw them in a cooler, or throw the ice bag in your live well with your fish, because we don't want to transport any of that water or moving from one water body to the next. For adults, as mentioned, they attach to hard surfaces, which would be boats, pontoons, boat lifts, aquatic vegetation. And so looking at aquatic vegetation, you can see that it's not invasive aquatic vegetation, it's all vegetation. It is illegal to have any vegetation on your boat or trailer when you're going down the roadway, because these zebra mussels don't have any preference over one or the other. So you want to make sure that all vegetation is gone once leaving a water body. These females produce up to 1 million eggs a year, and their adequate spawning temperatures would range from 50 to 55 degrees, but their maxes are just under 63 degrees Fahrenheit. If you look at the photo on the right, these grow in very dense mats, and they can actually grow on top of one another.